Fort Sumner, New Mexico, begins with General James H. Carlton. In September of 1862, General Carlton was given command of the New Mexico Military Department. And on the 31st of October, 1862, Congress authorized the building of a military post in the middle eastern part of New Mexico. Now this is an early beginning of Fort Sumner. The purpose was to protect settlers from the Comanche, Kiowa, and Mescalero Apache Indian raids. Along with Fort Sumner, the Bosque Redondo Reservation was established. The military was ordered to remove the Mescalero Apache and the Navajo from their native lands, which is now eastern Arizona and western New Mexico, and resettle them in the desolate Pecos River Valley. The idea was to teach Indians to become self-sufficient farmers. Orders were issued that all means shall be taken to accomplish this. By 1863, around 500 Mescalero Apaches were settled on the 40-square-mile reservation and around Fort Sumner. To accomplish the mission of defeating the Navajo Nation and transferring them some 300 miles to Fort Sumner, General Carlton called on his most experienced officer, Colonel Christopher Houston Kit Carson. Colonel Kit Carson was already a famous explorer, Indian fighter, and trapper. He had served as Indian agent, and his first 2 wives were Indians. He could speak several Indian dialects. Carson didn't want the assignment, though. He was already in his early 50s, and he wanted to spend time with his 3rd wife and their several children at their home in Taos, New Mexico. Carson had finally developed a cordial relationship with several Indian tribes, so he quickly handed in his resignation to General Carlton. Carlton refused to accept it. It was a real dilemma for Kit Carson, especially the orders that read, "Capture the women and children and kill all the men if any resistance." Although by most accounts Carson was considered to be an honest, honorable man even by Indians, he had never refused to obey a military order even if he disagreed with it. By 1864, Colonel Carson had several skirmishes with the Navajo, with 70-something warriors being killed, with little results being accomplished. Carson then started a full scorched earth policy. His goal was to starve the Indian nation into surrender by destroying their food supplies, killing their sheep and horses, and burning their hogans. And by the end of 1864, the Navajo was freezing and starving and ready for what they call the long walk. Some 8,000 or so Navajo made the long walk to the Bosque Redondo and Fort Sumner reservation. Hundreds will die on the trail. The Indians explained they couldn't understand why the soldiers was one day trying to kill them, and later on would allow their women and kids to ride on the wagons when there was room, and would often play with their children, even letting them ride on the backs of their horses with them. Now by 1865, the Apache was through farming. Some 500 escaped during the night, and they left the ones that were unable to travel to stoke the fires so that the soldiers from Fort Sumner would not know that they had left. The Navajo was not accustomed to farming, and the desolate land was not very productive, along with the Pecos River having alkali in it, making many sick. Here is the Navajo receiving rations from the military at Fort Sumner, which was costing the government more and more each year. This is a replica building of Fort Sumner and the way it looked back then. In 1866, Oliver Loving and Charles Goodnight, 2 Texas cattlemen, came up with a daring plan. to drive a herd of cattle to Fort Sumner and to sell the much-needed beef to the military to feed the Navajo population. Although it was a dangerous trip through hostile Indians, the cattle drive was successful. Seeing more profit to be made the next year, they planned another drive in 1867. Now this drive became the basis for the epic movie, Lonesome Dove. After the drive became delayed through trouble with hostiles and bad weather, Oliver Loving and a companion, one-armed Bill Wilson, attempted to go ahead of the cattle drive to assure the officials at Fort Sumner that the cattle was on its way. Before reaching Fort Sumner, the two were spotted by Comanche warriors. Taking refuge on the banks of the Pecos River, Loving was wounded in the arm and side. And under cover of darkness, Wilson went back for help to the cattle drive. And a couple of days later, after slipping upriver, Loving was rescued by traveling Mexicans on their way to Fort Sumner. Although his wounds were not life-threatening, his arm became severely infected. Now this is a replica of a restored army barracks at old Fort Sumner, perhaps a bunk like the one that Oliver Loving laid in while being treated for gangrene infection. The inexperienced army doctor was afraid to amputate until Charles Goodnight arrived and insisted. It was too late. After sitting by Oliver Loving's bed for 2 weeks, he died on September the 25th, 1867, after receiving a promise from his friend Charles Goodnight that he would take his body back to his family in Texas. He also continued their partnership for 2 years after Loving's death so that his family could pay off his bills. Loving's body was most likely buried here in the military cemetery at Fort Sumner. That same cemetery that Billy the Kid will be buried some 14 years later. After Loving's death, Goodnight will continue the drive on to Denver to sell the rest of the cattle. He'll return in the spring, dig up Loving's body, and take it back to Texas. Oliver Loving was 54 years old. That same year in 1868, the government sent General William T. Sherman, the famed Civil War general, to Fort Sumner to decide what to do with the Navajo. After strong negotiating with the Navajo chiefs, who refused to be moved to Oklahoma, Sherman relented and agreed to let them return back to their homelands in Arizona. Now this is the location where the Treaty of June 1st, 1868 was signed. Each year members of the tribe bring rocks and pile them up at the spot to honor their history. By the next year in 1869, Fort Sumner was completely abandoned by the military and the government. Lucien Bonaparte Maxwell in 1870 bought Fort Sumner and turned it into a town. He had been the largest landowner in the United States. Lucien Maxwell will make Fort Sumner his home and headquarters for his vast holdings. He will convert one of the officers' quarters into a 22-room mansion. He will die in quiet retirement on July the 25th, 1875, at the age of 56. Lucien Maxwell will be buried in the Fort Sumner Military Cemetery. His tombstone will show the outlines of the Maxwell land grant. His holdings will be turned over to his son Pedro, or Peter. He's called Pete. Lucien leaves responsibility for Fort Sumner to Pete. The building used by the military had all been turned into houses, stores, and shops. 6 years after Lucien Maxwell's death, Billy the Kid, William H. Bunny, will be killed in Fort Sumner by Sheriff Pat Garrett. Several theories over the years have been developed. Sheriff Garrett said it was quite by circumstance that he had come that fateful night to talk to Pete Maxwell about his knowledge of the whereabouts of Billy the Kid. He had suspected the kid of hanging around Fort Sumner, a place that he was very familiar with, and others say that it was Pete Maxwell himself that had tipped off Sheriff Garrett about Billy. That Billy, supposedly a friend of Maxwell's, was romantically involved with Pete's youngest sister, Pauletta. Pauletta always denied that she was involved with Billy. She knew him as others had, but in later years she stated he was actually involved with someone close to Pat Garrett, actually Garrett's own sister-in-law. The truth is that Billy's name had been associated with several young ladies, and some in and around Fort Sumner. The story that seems most reasonable to me was a first-hand account of one of the sheriff's deputies, Deputy John W. Poe. Poe was the man that Charlie Goodnight said you could count on for the truth. If you had been standing here around midnight on July the 14th, 1881, this is what you would see. The large building with a white picket fence was the Maxwell house. Pete Maxwell's bedroom, where Garrett killed Billy the Kid, was the corner room. Now, Deputy Poe stated they didn't believe that they would actually find Billy at Fort Sumner. They had heard rumors of him being there, but Garrett thought surely he'd be on his way to Texas or Mexico where he'd be safe. They decided to sneak in at night because Billy had several Mexican friends in Fort Sumner. Their idea was to speak with Pete Maxwell about Billy's whereabouts. Deputy Poe said that Sheriff Garrett told the two deputies to stay and wait while he went in to speak with Pete. Poe sat down on the steps going through the picket fence gate on the east side of the house, and Deputy Kemp McKinney was squatted just outside the fence, when suddenly Deputy Poe spotted someone coming towards the Maxwell house just inside the south gate. He was without shoes and no hat, and appeared to be holding up his pants. Neither deputies had ever seen Billy before, and believed that the young stranger was someone that worked for Maxwell, or could be his brother-in-law that lived next to Pete on the north side. They had no idea, according to Poe, that it was Billy the Kid, even after he asked who they were, and then backed into Maxwell's bedroom. Now, Maxwell slept with the door open because it was warm weather. After hearing the two shots from Sheriff Garrett, did they realize that they had just met Billy the Kid. Notice the adobe long building at the bottom of the picture. It's believed that Billy may have been staying with a friend somewhere in this building. The story was that Billy was going to the Maxwell house to cut off a slice of beef that he knew was hanging on Pete Maxwell's porch. Billy's marker was placed where Pete Maxwell's bedroom was located, and Billy the Kid was killed. Billy the Kid is buried in the old Fort Sumner Military Cemetery, only a few hundred yards from where he was killed. Billy is buried next to his two pals, Tom O'Flaherty, killed at Fort Sumner by Pat Garrett's posse, and Charlie Beaudry, ambushed at Stinking Springs by Garrett's posse, thinking that he was Billy the Kid. Within a few hundred feet of the grave of Billy is Lucian Maxwell and his son Pete Maxwell, who died June the 21st, 1898, at the age of 50. At the head and to the left of Pete's grave is his sister Pauletta. Some believe that she was the real reason that Billy the Kid would not leave Fort Sumner. Pauletta died from Bright's disease on December the 7th, 1929. Her death brings to a close the violent history of Fort Sumner, New Mexico.